What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. Today I'm going to be talking with Philip Gelatt and Morgan Galen King, the two filmmakers behind what I regard as a landmark movie in the history of animation, The Spine of Night. This is one of those movies where as I was watching it, I almost felt as if the filmmakers were taking requests and giving me the kind of dark adult fantasy epic that I so often crave but rarely find. So thank you to both of you for making me a very satisfied movie fan, and thanks for agreeing to join me tonight to discuss your work. Also, I should add that initially we'll be avoiding all plot-specific questions for anyone who's not yet seen the film, and I will give a proper heads up before we do the deep dive. So fellas, welcome to Wrong Reel or YouTube or I don't know I'm doing it for both Wrong Reel as well as my YouTube channel, so I don't know what the appropriate welcome is, but welcome all the same.
Well, thank you so much for having us. This is awesome.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here wherever we are.
Yeah, exactly. When I posted my review, I guess back in March, when Morgan Galen King responded, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And that's when you gave me the soft commit at the time to come on and talk about the work. So yeah, I'm just thrilled that here we are after the release of the movie, getting to do the deep dive.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Fantastic. I mean, you has very kind things to say about the film, so it's very exciting. I'm glad to be able to speak with
it's the kind of movie, the movie made it very easy to say some very flattering things, and we'll get into the specifics as to why I was such a fan. But as we start to go, but let's warm up with some kind of easy questions. So let's talk about just the origins of this movie. I love Morgan's early shorts on his channel and how they established the character of Mongrel, who would eventually be played by Joe Manganiello in Spine of Night. And I'm particularly obsessed with the brilliant short film Exordium, which really tees up Spine of Night and the character of the Guardian. So how did this fictional setting initially come to be, get fleshed out? And how did the two of you decide to write a screenplay for this movie?
Well, I mean, for me, it really started in, I'd done graphic design and worked with record labels for most of my 20s, and it just felt really, really burned out on it and wanted to transition to doing something on my own, or like that was my own creation. And, I'd gone to college for film, like I wanted to make film forever. And, but I got out of school, it's like before the digital era. So like we were still editing on, SVHS then. And so, once I'd stopped doing that, I was like, well, how can I apply the skills I have to make films with the money I have, which was none, and the talent which I have, which is no one, in a space that's only my living room. And, I thought about what was like the thing that didn't exist that I loved, and it was rotoscope fantasy films that I'd grown up with. So it was sort of a process of just reverse engineering, like the Ralph Bakshi look. I'd gone to like my Fire and Ice DVD, watched the making of things, sort of studied how they did it, and thought, well, I will try to do something like that. And then as I kept working it, like the world became more refined. I figured, I felt like I was getting closer and closer to the look that I wanted it to look like. And the work is so slow, rotoscoping, a famously tedious process, that I had a lot of time just to think about the world and think, like, if you spend 4 days drawing, one sword, then you're like, I wonder where that sword came from. I wonder where that helmet came from. Everything takes on a life because you're just with it for so long. So the world just kind of grew from the process of doing it over and over again. And then eventually, people had paid a little bit of attention to the second Mongrel short, and I thought, well, I should try to do something for real, or that was like not an experiment, but actually a short film. And I worked with this guy in Philadelphia, Josh Jones, and we'd directed some of his friends in, at the time, the biggest production I'd done so far that was not in my living room. And then I spent 10 months drawing it, and it was entered into they asked me for it, the Machinima Interactive Film Festival, which no longer exists. I don't think Machinima exists, and I don't think they ever did the film festival.
I used to watch a lot of the World of Warcraft videos back like in the, I guess, the early or late aughts.
Yeah. I mean, it felt like it was everywhere, and for like early like nerd culture on YouTube back in the day. But they were kind enough to host my film as far as part of their thing. And it ended up making its way into Phil's inbox, and he reached out to me.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And Phil, had you at this point already started working on other animated movies like Love, Death, and Robots, or was this prior to that?
This was prior to that. It took a very long time to get Spine of Night completed. So this was probably 2 years before I started working on Love, Death, and Robots, and then and that had its own lengthy production period as well. But the whole time I was working on Love, Death, and Robots, this was all going on in the background. But like you, I saw the Exordium short film and was like, oh, this was made for me. This is like a thing that I love, done both in a visual style that felt special, and also telling a story that felt like a type of fantasy that one rarely sees on the screen. So so when I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I should be doing. I should talk to whoever it is that made this thing and make something with him. So I sent Morgan a message, I think on Facebook at first, and then we sort of graduated to email correspondence, and it was just like, let's make something, whatever. We can do a sequel to Exordium, or we can work on some other idea, but let's figure out something to do. And very quickly that became the rudiments of the Spine of Night, and we started working on the script, and it all sort of flowed from that initial correspondence.
Now, are you a particularly intense fan of the anthology format? Because I love anthology movies, but I feel like anthology movies always wrestle with this problem where there's that emotional reset in between segments that sometimes can be kind of exhausting for the viewer. But I feel like with Love, Death, and Robots, you got that classic anthology format, whereas with Spine of Night, it's loosely anthological, if that's a word, but
Yep.
it's all tied together with the central theme and central characters that kind of makes it feel more interconnected. As a writer, was it kind of a challenge to like rewire your brain to write in that way as opposed to traditional kind of short films?
I mean, for me, no, not really. I mean, I had, even before I started talking to Morgan, I don't remember how I had started thinking about it, but I was already thinking that I wanted to try to do something in an anthological way, just because I feel like there is opportunities for narrative there that are different than a traditional, 3-act feature format. So I was already really curious to try to do something in the anthology format. So Spine of Night does, to me, it's like an anthological experiment, right? To do interconnected sort of standalone stories set across a great swath of history. And then Love, Death, and Robots is just, as you say, it's purely anthological. There's really no connective tissue there at all, really, other than it's adult
Apart from the
animation.
fact that a lot of them are just really fucking cool, because I really enjoy Love, Death, and Robots as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the motto, the unwritten motto of that show is very much like, oh, we're just going to show you a bunch of cool shit. Pardon my French. Cool stuff.
Oh no, so speak as colorfully as you like.
Okay. Oh, that's a dangerous thing to say.
Well, it's like Spine of Night. It's like, it's so much graphic content. It's like you can't discuss Spine of Night without getting, I guess,
adult.
A little more adult in the way we express
Yeah,
ourselves.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, speaking of adult animation, I've got some experience in the world of adult animation with working with director Bill Plimpton, and I know that can be an enormous challenge convincing people that adult animation even has like a role in with the American consumer. It seems like abroad, France, Japan, Eastern Europe, they have no problem wrestling with the idea of animation with an adult sensibility, with adult themes, with much more graphic content. But in America, I've always been a frustrated fan. And apart from Ralph Bakshi in the 70s and early 80s, there's not a lot of success stories on that front. So as someone who loves that period, I was really into how your movie, on one hand, kind of tipped its hat to that period, but at the same time, it really felt fresh, like you're breaking all this new ground with this really modern and wildly original dark fantasy epic. So let's just talk about just rotoscoping and your approach, your specific approach, because I've never seen rotoscoping that looks specifically like the Spine of Night. So how did y'all kind of develop this overall style, tone, and look for this movie?
Well, I mean, for sure, it was the Ralph Bakshi films that we were drawing on. I mean, I think, American Pop and Fire and Ice were big, goalposts. And the Tarna segment, the last segment from the heavy metal movie, it was the other one that we're all sort of like trying to synthesize those into an aesthetic that was, I mean, I wish that we had, 75 animators all working day and night on the process, but it ended up being like how can we do that with a smaller crew on modern hardware? I mean, I think that I love the pencil line, like in some of the, especially Fire and Ice, you can still see some of the pencil work.
You see the hand of the artist. It's fantastic.
So we wanted to retain that, but also, I mean, I don't have the hardware in my living room to do the exact light box setup that he would have had. So we drew it in Photoshop on Wacom tablets, but it's still, it's still frame by frame. It's still onion skin based animation, so it's keyframed. It's like that. There's no, like, I know there's a lot of sort of modern hardware coming out, like AI driven stuff, like EB Synth, which is very powerful, but cannot quite accomplish what the look we're going for. So like splitting the difference to make it feel as handmade as the old stuff as we could, while still making it with a very small team. I mean, I think we had 4 animators ultimately, but only ever 3 working at one time. So I mean, where Bakshi would have had 75 or something on his films. So like trying to get it done in that sense was a real challenge. And I hope we hit a good middle ground between it feeling kind of modern and kind of 1978.
Well, it's an homage to that period, but it doesn't feel retro to me. And I love 70s fantasy, whether you're talking about fiction or D&D or whatever the case might be, but never at any point when I'm watching The Spine of Night do I feel like, oh, this is like an old-fashioned movie. It feels very current. And I think like a 19-year-old kid right now is going to see this movie and just feel like they got like electricity blasting through their veins.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things too, is as much as we loved the old stuff, like we didn't want to just make pastiche. Like we didn't just want to recreate the thing they did, but how could we iterate on that in a way that still felt like the thing we loved, but wasn't embarrassing to show my wife? Because, I think there's a lot of like the way we navigated the kinds of characters and the way the characters looked, like it was really intentional to make it feel like a modern story and not old. I love the old stuff, but like, yeah, I think it's was sort of a missed opportunity in the 70s to not, even for that time, modernize a lot of like the weird fantasy and weird horror from the 30s. Like they carried a lot of the less than awesome stuff forward, even through all that time. So it felt like if we were going to do it, we had to be true to the thing that we loved, but also not like blinded by nostalgia and just reiterate the old thing.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the swords and the nudity, et cetera, and so forth, but you also you take it so much further than a lot of people have tried to take it in the past. And I think obviously a huge part of that is this incredible cast that you assembled with legends like Richard E. Grant, Lucy Lawless, but there's one cast member in particular who's more than just a movie actor and celebrity, but he's also a celebrity in the world of tabletop RPGs. I'm talking about Joe Manganiello, who's one of the most famous players of D&D in all of Hollywood. Did his obsession with fantasy play a role in his casting at all? Or did y'all have any discussions about that background in terms of his approach to the character of Mongrel? Because obviously Mongrel is kind of your baby that you've been working on for 10 years at this point, it seems like.
Well, go ahead,
Phil.
I mean,
Certainly Joe's cachet as a famous D&D and player, and also he has death saves. Like he has the whole company that's sort of devoted to dark fantasy artwork, right? Like, and I learned when we were recording with him, he's also like a great collector of that artwork. Like he just legitimately loves it. So that we really, knowing that about him, that was really, aside from him being perfect for the part, that was why we approached him for it, figuring that if there was anybody in Hollywood who would watch the film and get it, it would be him, right?
Yeah.
Like if he didn't get it, then I think we would have had to seriously rethink that what we've been doing, because we would have been like, well, we missed that target. So yeah, I mean, we approached him for the part. He very quickly said yes. And in discussing the role, I mean, we didn't specifically reference any of his, D&D playing. I mean, other than I was like,
Hand of Vecna video and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But we more talked about Mongrel just in terms of like, who the character of Mongrel is and how we should play it and that kind of stuff. But he was great. I mean, he really so most of the voices we recorded during COVID, his voice we recorded before COVID. So actually in the studio, I got to watch him do it live, which was great. Spent a little bit of time like mimicking the action to bring himself
Yeah, he might be the one
role.
actor who's like more ripped and shredded than the characters
Yes.
in your movie.
Yeah,
He's just
yeah.
a larger than life figure. But yeah, I'm just a huge
Yeah.
fan.
Yeah, he's fantastic. Yeah, so talented and such a sweet guy, and so like such a fan. Like it's so nice to meet somebody who is just like without pretense into this stuff, and he absolutely is. So yeah.
Beautiful. Well, let's talk a little bit just about like the ingredients that go into this sadly kind of neglected subgenre. And obviously nudity and blood are big no-nos in a lot of American animation. But for me, when it comes to sword and sorcery, whether you're talking about art from heavy metal or, Frank Frazetta covers to like old, like Conan collections, whatever the case might be, there's certain ingredients that people think of when I think of sword and sorcery, but your movie goes so much further than those classic tropes with like some really wild, so oftentimes someone even say like disturbing imagery with like nude people carrying like a pyramid, like this throne for Galsur as these minions are massacring a city. Did the two of you have any internal debate about just how far you'd be willing to go with the more graphic scenes in your story? Because I mean, that first battle scene in the swamp lets you know immediately, oh, okay, we're just in full frontal nudity, chopping people to pieces. Like we're just going for it. And of course, then you just keep kind of escalating up until the very end of the movie. At any point, you don't think we need to tap the brakes for commercial constraints? Because obviously, as a fan, I totally eat this up, but I recognize I'm a minority voice in terms of loving all this stuff.
I mean, for me, and a lot of it was only possible because of like the unrelenting support of both Phil and Will, our other producer, to do this totally independently. Like it almost felt like we were obligated to push the envelope a little bit because the opportunity arises so rarely to get to make this kind of thing on any kind of scale, much less a feature film scale. So like I don't. We weren't trying to be, I don't think, like edgy exactly. Like we wasn't trying to shock anybody out of their minds. Like I can imagine more horrific.
It doesn't feel
things,
forced or for its own sake.
Yeah.
But a lot of people who are just accustomed to Pixar, ho ho ho, and
yeah. So like I wanted to be true to what it was. I grew up on like my perfect, like my idealized version of an independent film is Evil Dead.
Gotcha.
And so that's like the bar I wanted to reach of like in terms of tone, in terms of like the level of what we're showing. Like I don't know, that's the goal to me. And I always think it's disappointing when you see something that could have shown you anything and still gives you like someone swings a sword in front of someone and they just fall over. Like I feel like that cheapens the violence or trivializes the violence in a way that doesn't serve the narrative. And also, like, I don't know, from heavy metal, I feel like we're owed that as an audience, just to at least enjoy it a little bit in a gruesome sense.
Yeah, for people who love this stuff, I mean, heavy metal, in a lot of ways, for many, many years, was the only movie you could point to, really, that was exploring this space. Whereas they say you like film noir, you like westerns, or you like screwball comedies. You got hundreds, if not thousands, of movies to point to, and I feel like this audience is probably the most underserved audience imaginable, which I think is why people who get it are just going to completely embrace it and really get it all the way. And so I've seen it 3 times now. And it's still, as I watch it, it still hits me like, oh, like when I see people getting like, severed from like the taint to the top of their head or whatever the case might be, it really is visceral. And I guess it goes back to the rotoscoping. It just lends that weight to the action that you don't see in a lot of other action movies. But also, if you're making a small movie, you might as well offer something that can't be found with a larger scaled film because they're already doing that. They've already got that space. So why not completely compete in some area where nobody's playing in that sandbox?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Not that an independent animated film needs to be gory and naked, but it's like the one place where a film could be is in the independent space. And I'm very, being part of that is really exciting to me, like to be one of the rare things that has made it out. Like I was so thrilled to see Crypto Zoo this year because it similarly is incredibly gory and has lots of nudity. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize we were both working in the same place. I think it's so freeing and exciting to have that even be a part of the discussion going on in contemporary animation.
Beautiful. Well, I'm really into classic mythology, and one of the chapters of y'all's film that I found most stimulating was the explanation behind your world's kind of grand mythos. It's like it's got its own pantheon of gods and giants, and how the bloom came to be discovered by mankind. Were the two of you inspired by any particular creation myths? And how did you decide upon the really distinctive look of this particular section relative to the rest of the film?
Morgan, go ahead.
Well, okay. I feel like I've been blabbing on.
It's okay. I'm gonna sip my water.
Okay.
Eat some animal crackers.
Yeah, I will. Ooh, good idea.
I mean, in terms of like the origin myth, like I think it's sort of like a summation of a lot of different origin myths. Like there's sort of an myth that permeates throughout all human creation stories. So I think we're roughly working in that sense. I think there's a really fundamentally fascinating, child's question of like, like where did God come from? And you're like, did God have a father? And you're like, yeah. And you're like, well, who was his father? And like the infinite regression of where did existence come from is such a fundamentally interesting question, no matter how you're approaching your cosmology. So I want to sort of touch on that. In terms of the style, we went back and forth on that a lot. It was one of
There's a brief taste in exordium where you show like 3 seconds that's similar, like ooh, and that's all. I mean, it's just like a little tease in the short.
Yeah, so taking that forward, where the outlines are made out of stars, seemed like a really fun challenge to sort of push that a little further. And then the rest of the segment is all done in silhouettes, which we didn't plan on. We knew we wanted to make that sequence feel different from the other styles, but we tried several things. So we experimented with a lot of different ideas of like what could the story within a story be that works as different. But then ultimately, I was thinking of the shadow play part from Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, where they sort of recount the story of Gollum getting the ring through they just hang like a burlap sack and backlight it with red. But the shadow play of that seemed like such a fun thing to work in, which ended up being by far the most fun part to animate of the whole film, both because it was really fast. It's much faster to animate when you don't have to do all the character details. But it was just the whole sequence was like, we'd really rigidly storyboarded it, and it had all sorts of cool moments of, giants and violence and.
Also, every fantasy setting needs some sort of history, whether you're talking about Tolkien and his Silmarillion or whatever the case might be. But I like how you wait until about 2/3 of the way through the movie to give us this section. And then it's like, all right, now here comes the final segment, like your big, just crowd pleasing, epic combat. Just like, I mean, this, once again, you mentioned Tarna earlier. This is your Tarna sequence, which comes right afterwards. But it's a great 7th inning stretch where you get to kind of exhale, relax, and then you're ready for that last big surge at the end.
I hope so. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's dip into the spoiler section of this conversation. As I mentioned before we started recording, I run a regular D&D game, some diehard film freaks. They all are content creators, whether they're authors or podcasters or filmmakers, and they all have seen the movie, and they've all got a couple of questions for you. So we'll start with Victor Rodriguez. He's an author and he's the host of The Sound of Fear. And he's the first person who gave me the heads up about The Spine of Night, showed me the trailer before it came out at South by Southwest. And he just has a short and sweet question. He says, what short stories or novels you would recommend for fans like him of The Spine of Night?
Well, Phil probably has more because he's much better read than I am. But the one thing I feel like I brought up a lot in talking about the film, and I'm always surprised that people don't know it because it's a staple of my literary background, is A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. It's a 1959 post-apocalyptic sci-fi novel that is the sole basis, really, for the narrative structure we're working with, which is where it's broken up into 3 parts, each one separated by centuries, and you see the echo effect of each era carried forward. And it's full of monks trying to like transcribe the past and how that just sort of spills out of control moving forward, and becomes incredibly existential. It's an amazing work that it's like a classic to me, but I'm surprised that it is less known than I thought it was. So that's a huge recommendation for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a ton of stuff I could recommend. Some of it widely known, some of it not as much. I guess the stuff that I like, and I don't know, you don't detect a lot of it in Spine of Night, but like I'm really into I don't even know how you term these writers, but like M. John Harrison's work, in particular Viraconium, which is a series of fantasy, like I don't even know what you would call this, 3 novellas all set in the city called Viraconium, each one stranger, more strange than the last. Highly recommend Viraconium. A series of books by a woman named Steph Swainston called what are they called? I can't remember. The first one is called The Year of Our War, and they're set in this crazy fantasy world where there is a king, or an emperor, I guess he is, and he, whoever is there's like he has like 100 top stewards, and they are, each of them represents the best in the land, and he makes them immortal. So there's like the archer, and he's literally just called the archer, and he's the best archer, and he will live for forever until somebody beats him. And then the lead character is I can't remember what they call him, the messenger or something. He has wings and he can fly, and he's the fastest person. So he's like the emperor's messenger. And they're at war, as you are sometimes, with insects that have torn a hole in their reality and are pouring through into the northern part of the continent. And it's about their war with the insects, but then also it's has this other aspect to it where our lead character is addicted to a psychedelic drug. Then when he uses it, he enters this other universe that has certain things from our world, like that people drive Corvettes and they wear t-shirts. They're an absolutely amazing series of novels, totally bizarre, and really great. My last recommendation, also written by a woman named KJ Bishop, is a book called The Etched City, which I don't know if I can pitch it succinctly, but it fits in the same sort of phantasmagorical, surreal vein of a fantasy fiction that I absolutely love. And again, not a huge part of the DNA of Spine of Night, but I just think if you're into like really imaginative fantasy worlds that don't necessarily come from the Tolkien tradition, you would probably dig M. John Harrison, Steph Swainston, or KJ Bishop for sure.
Yeah, I get a little tired of stories that are blatantly derivative of Tolkien. I love Tolkien, but I don't want to only read Tolkien. And so I love like R. Scott Bakker. He's got all these crazy, really dark epic fantasy, and Joe Abercrombie. And I feel like
I love Joe Abercrombie stuff is amazing.
He's I just finished his most recent one a couple of weeks ago, but I feel like as underserved as the audience for this genre might be in film and television, at least in the world of fiction, the shelves are breaking under the weight of all the incredible stuff out there. And I feel like we're kind of quietly living through this like second golden age of great fantasy, whether you want to call it grimdark, whatever the case might be, but there's so much variety that are establishing new traditions and new tropes. So it's a very exciting time to be a fan of that genre. But let's talk about what makes your movie so distinctive. Just piggybacking off what Victor mentioned, he also mentioned during one of our sessions how, while we've seen a lot of great brutal combat in movies like Fire and Ice, we very rarely see really original depictions of sorcery or black magic. And I 100% agree. Y'all's magic system felt completely unique. And it's almost, in gaming terms, it's almost like we watched Gal Sewer's journey from level 1 to when he unlocks the secrets of the dark arts to finally becoming this like sorcerer king on the cusp of godhood. What was your creative process for cooking up this really distinctive, off the beaten path depiction of where magic comes from and how like people can harness those powers?
Oh man. Well, I feel back because we wrote this in 2014. I remember specifically wanting to push back against, there's like an IO9 article from 2013 about like why magic and fiction is better when there's a rigid system. Excuse me. And I remember thinking like, that's not magical. Like I love it in a game.
It feels like accounting if it's too rigid.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's fun, magic, but like we all play D&D. How many people have ever kept up with components? few people want to be bothered with like
maybe once every 2 or 3 sessions.
Yeah.
And notice how y'all included Bigby's crushing hand in the movie. I was like, I know they know their ninth level spells.
And so like I wanted to do something that was like more shamanic, probably more druggy, that was just more like experiential magic and more like where it's more about like, I mean, I don't know enough about like occult Satanism stuff to like talk about it with any sort of authority, but I've skimmed it enough to sort of see like how you would have like a focus and it's really more like, is it the plume that's magical or is it really just like a manifestation of your will on reality? So I think like keeping it really vague and not systematic allowed us to like, we were mindful of it not being just, it's just whatever you want it to be. But I think by keeping it not as rigid, it let it feel more occult and esoteric.
Yeah, I mean, I love writing magic stuff, like all the chanting and stuff in the movie. And I think my opinion, I'm 100% on the same page with Morgan. I don't know if we read that same. I forgot about that IO9 article. I must have read it at the time and also been equally annoyed by it. But like, I do feel like, especially coming from the world of Hollywood screenplay writing, as I do, like, you can't pitch a supernatural thing without somebody asking you, well, what are the rules of this world? Well, what's the rules of the ghost? What are the rules of this? And I hate that for the same reason that Morgan does, and particularly in the case of magic, because, and I'm going to paraphrase somebody, I don't know who said this or when or why or where, but that magic, I think, is most interesting when it's not a science, but it's an art, right? So it is like unique to the person who's doing it, and it's an expression of their interior state. But I think important for the creation of the movie was just to make sure that every character using the magic felt like they knew exactly what they were doing, right? Because I think that is a thing that's missing when you get asked in screenplay writing about, well, what are the rules? Like it kind of doesn't matter as long as the people inside the fiction understand them and are engaging with them in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, no, so we get to see his journey, like discover, like when he gets that text, when he's chained up and he's been doing all these like occult experiments, but suddenly it's an aha moment for him and it unlocks all these secrets. So it makes it feel so compelling and lived in and believable, even if the rules are whatever the two of you decide.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Well, from Moose Matson, a YouTuber, it's more of a statement than a question, but he says in the 70s, he initially struggled to get into Ralph Bakshi's rotoscoped Lord of the Rings because he'd already fallen in love with the Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit, and he was kind of locked in on that style. But having now seen your movie, he was amazed by the fluidity of the character's movements and how when it's rotoscoped, the violence feels so much more brutal with your approach. So I'll turn this into a question. What's the trick to making your combat scenes in rotoscoped animation feel so grounded, ruthless, and impactful?
I mean, one of the big attractions of rotoscoping to me as an aesthetic approach is that everyone watching it understands, oh, that's how a human body moves. And you bake in all the things you know about the human body. So it's not like, a Looney Tunes cartoon where, like, if you drop an anvil on someone's head, they're going to bounce right back up, or they get run over by a steamroller, they're flat for a second and they're fine. Like, because, they're cartoons, but I think the rotoscope animation, you have a sense that these people are as fragile as real humans, but then also they're in a cartoon-ish world where any possible type of damage is imminently possible. Like their reality is so permeable and flexible at our evil whims that. So I think it feels. I think it feels more like human suffering than like I said, an anvil or a steamroller.
Yeah, I love it. But it reminds me a bit when you watch like a PG-13 action movie, people shooting machine guns, and it's like, well, it's almost kind of irresponsible not to show what would really happen when the bullets hit the body. Spot of Night shows you exactly what would happen when like a halberd connects with somebody's skull.
If you happen to have necromantically charged finger tools and happen to swipe them through
Absolutely.
an
Now you
onrushing
know to be
crowd,
careful when you play with
yeah,
them.
you know what might happen.
Absolutely.
I mean, as a kid, I grew up when like GI Joe was on all the time, and it was always like, oh, they're like shooting rockets at each other's jets. And, oh well, good thing everyone made it out with a
They always
parachute.
eject. Yeah, they would always eject.
And it feels like it cheapens it. Like it makes it feel like one of the like thematically, I really wanted to talk about like the cost of heroism, the cost of violence. Like if it's not if you walk
Especially the
away
last
thinking
segment, that raid on the city with those winged characters, they're all making sacrifices, and it's bone chilling to watch.
yeah, it's certainly the most gruesome to me. The one guy gets it the worst, I think, in the whole film.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know how to rank the most gruesome kill scenes in your movie. There are a lot, there are a lot of them to choose from. But here's another comment from Martin Kessler from Flixwise Canada. He said, "One thing I think they really nailed that a lot of 70s, 80s throwback type films can't seem to get right is the pacing. Even though it's basically an anthology film, it just moved like an 80s movie. So to springboard off that, my question would be, how did you manage to avoid the pitfalls and traps that so many anthology films fall into, where the audience slowly starts to become exhausted in between each chapter, where I feel like this film just keeps building and building to the epic finale between Galsur and I'm blanking on the name of Lucy Lawless's character. What's the correct pronunciation of her character's name?
Zod.
Zod. All right, kneel before Zod.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess we've already tackled this a little bit when it comes to anthologies, but structurally, were you aware of like the need of having to build this sense of like real forward momentum so that people wouldn't kind of check out in between segments?
I mean, we definitely were thinking about heavy metal, and like so many of those stories existed in the comic before they were in the film. And so then the Lochnar green orb that they use as a device to weave them together, like even as a kid, always felt a little shoehorned in. As much as I love it,
I always forget that it's even in there, even when they're wrestling over it in the den segment. I mean, I love the Neverwhere segment, but I was like, oh yeah, that's that thing it's in all these shorts. Yeah.
So like like the idea was like, what if these were more intentionally connected from the inception rather than doing it from the other direction? I mean, beyond that, I don't know, Phil. What would you say in terms of?
I mean,
this?
I would say it is, one of the things that the movie does, and this is by design, is, it is anthological in that these are interconnected sort of standalone stories, but I think increasingly as the movie goes on, we're not really stopping to do exposition every time we jump into a story, and particularly by the time we get to the end, it's very much like, here's a war, here's a city, and here are three people dressed as birds. Guess what? That's all you get to know. Go. So I think sometimes that exhaustion comes in anthological feature films because because it's like it's up and down and up and down. You're like stopping and starting, you're stopping and starting. So I think, although I don't know if we ever really discussed it, but it was at least editorially important, I think, to make sure that at the beginning of when we drop the viewers into every new anthology piece, we are continuing to keep the pace up and to make sure that we're not slowing down. I mean, an example of stuff that we cut out, for example, is in that sequence in the city with the bird people. We had shot a bunch of stuff that made that city feel, and I still have some regrets that we cut it out, but it made that city feel like there were more people living in it, right? Like we had this montage of like what the citizens did knowing that their city was doomed. And we cut it both for pace and honestly for schedule too, because we just weren't going to be able to animate it. But the more I think about it, the more I consider it to be our French plantation scene in Apocalypse Now, like a great sequence, but when you put that back into Apocalypse Now, it murders the pace of that movie.
I 100%
kills
agree.
it dead. Yeah.
I can't stand Redux, even though the scene in isolation is well shot, well produced,
great.
well acted.
Yep.
It does not need to be in that movie, because the Heart of Darkness novel
kills the
gets
movie,
darker and darker and darker and more
Yep.
intense, and that suddenly that allows you to kind of come up for air for a little bit, and you should never be able to come up for air.
No, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it is as much a script thing to be aware of as it is like an editorial thing to be aware of, just to like keep the pace moving forward. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, here's a question from Dan Pullen from Movies from Hell. Do they want to join our party? We need a cleric or a thief. But Morgan and I were talking before we started recording about how he's been, he is a fan of the Dark Souls franchise. Or does your schedules, now that you're making movies, do they permit a lot of gaming in your spare time?
I mean, I think we both try to do some. I mean, we've throughout the production cycle, we'd get on. I mean, certainly during the pandemic, have done a handful of runs with like us and some of the cast from the film. We were just
Manganiello does this Friday night game with like Vince Vaughn and all the it's like all these movie stars show up to play D&D every Friday night. Like, forget about
ours. Isn't quite that glitzy, but we did a run on. We were playing a Morkborg. If you know that one, it's like a Dark Souls inspired tabletop game.
Cool.
That we had a lot of fun with, and we were doing Mothership.
Mothership is what it's called, yeah.
The Alien inspired RPG. So we played both of those in the last couple of years.
Very nice.
I mean, I think everything I know about trying to structure a fantasy story comes from role playing games first. So I mean, I've been playing since I got the red box at the toy store.
The classic Larry Elmore cover, or was it the Earl Otis cover? I guess there was like two different versions of the basic set, but eventually the Larry Elmore was the classic iconic cover.
I had the Larry Elmore for sure. I did not have the Earl Otis.
Yeah.
I'm looking it up. Let's double check.
But I love all the art from that period. Is pretty astonishing stuff. Well,
yes,
in terms of just like those influences and your tastes and preferences, in addition to fiction, I feel like when people are going to watch this movie and they're going to watch it again and again, and they're going to watch Exordium, but there's going to be afterwards, I think some people out there are like, shit, I want to stay in this world a little longer. So first question, will there be more stories set in this fictional setting? And B, if not, how can somebody kind of scratch that itch? What can they watch? What can they play where it wouldn't necessarily have the same aesthetic, but they might find it equally satisfying if they're looking for more experiences in a similar vein that really, deliver some of the juice that the Spine of Night delivers.
Oh man. Well, I'll answer the first one. I'll leave Phil the hard one.
Oh, damn it.
Look, I could open a tab and go through my letterbox list, and I could probably put something together, but we'd be here for 25 minutes. In terms of making more, I mean, the Spine of Night kind of grew out of it taking 10 months to draw Exordium, and all the time I could spend thinking about what would be fun to do with the story. Similarly, we've been drawing this thing for 7 years plus another year of additional production. So really 8 years to think about what else we could do with it, and inevitably we've written a preposterous amount of outlines and future stories and all sorts of things. So that stuff definitely exists in our brains. I think the question is going to be, can we get a team and the money and all the stuff together to actually make it happen? Because I think no one wants us to spend 8 years between chapters. So figuring out that next step of what we can do and what someone wants to finance is going to be the big challenge. So all the support we can get now honestly really helps. I always feel, I mean, I'm sure everyone thinks that please support my independent films so that I can make more independent films when their thing comes out. But what more we'll be able to do is going to be very dependent on how this one's received.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of what you can watch or read that will similarly deliver. Such a hard question. There centuries worth of possible answers. So let me say, if you how to even approach this. I would say if you see the Spine of Night and you're not aware of the original Bakshi films, you could certainly watch those. I would say similarly, if you see the Spine of Night and you've never gone back and looked at the original, let's say 6 years of Heavy Metal magazine, well worth your time to spend some time with that. At the same time, there were other sort of big magazines that were doing a similar thing, the name of which escaped me for right now, but they are out there. I think even Marvel had one that was like Epic Magazine or something that was adult genre stuff. That was
Yeah, Jim
really,
Starlin was doing like epic
Yes.
comics for them for a while, like
Yes.
Dreadstar and things like that.
that's exactly what I'm thinking of.
I
Yeah.
was just reading the Richard Corbin one, and the name escapes me. The one that
Yeah.
he was the editor on.
Yeah, I mean, Neverwhere by Richard Corbin, but anything and everything by Richard Corbin from any stage in his career is for me all just chocolate for the eyeballs. I just adore it all.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So if you have seen all of that, wait, I'm sorry. The one other thing, it's live action, but the 1982 Conan the Barbarian is a movie that I constantly bring up as like among my perfect films.
It's unique. There's no other
yeah.
movie like it. It's got a
There-
philosophy.
Yep.
No other movie goes there.
No other movie does what that movie does. It's everything about it is amazing. But I'm going to assume that a lot of people who like Spine of Night have probably digested a lot of that same material. So in that case, I guess it gets a little bit harder to answer. I mean, I think I think about like the fantasy fiction of this is also from the 70s days, but like Karl Edward Wagner stuff, his Kane books are really good and a really like dark, interesting take on, it's like an anti-hero version of Conan, basically. Are really, really good. There's an anime movie that I only saw after we started working on this called Angel's Egg, right? That's what it's called.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah.
Absolutely incredible.
Oshii, the guy who did Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, well worth seeing. Just beautiful and strange, and a really unique fantasy
And really
world.
abstract. I mean, it's like very little traditional narrative, really mysterious. But that's what one of the things that drew me to Exordium when I first saw it. It was also mysterious, and it didn't follow traditional narrative arc. And that's why I really love these. Both the short and the feature. They're carving into new terrain, and fantasy, as much as I love it, so much of fantasy is just blatantly copying what has come before. And I love how these films refuse to do so.
Yeah.
I mean, that's awesome to hear. I mean, it's very much what we wanted to do. Like it wasn't, I mean, on one hand, I think it's being willfully difficult, but like also we felt like there was so much more that was unexplored and untapped, at least I mean, like you were saying, in literature, there's a lot more, but in terms of film, not much.
And then to play, I would recommend Mork Borg. I've heard, again, I'm going to assume most people have played or are currently playing 5th edition, but if you want like a different flavor of D&D and you've never gone back to play like 1st edition clones, like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, or what's the one that I love so much that I'm going to blank on the name now, Dungeon Crawl Classic is a really great system, and just like books full of wild artwork and tons of randomization tables that are just fantastic.
Yeah, it seems like the retro gaming scene is coming on strong, where people are really trying to recreate the emotion of that late 70s, early 80s experience for people who are 20 now and are like, oh, well, I like 5th edition, but what's all this crap from way back when that people keep talking about? How can I explore that world, and so on and so forth? So
spell components, you got all sorts of encumbrance to deal with. It's a lot.
Absolutely. And if you get resurrected, you're gonna have to spend like a month healing.
Never mess around with Thaco. Never go AD&D.
But what's even worse than Thaco is those like attack matrices from the original DM's guide, where it's like, oh my god, like, do I need to just put the whole matrix on my character sheet so I know what I need to hit these different ACs? Like, and then all the modifiers for different weapons for different. I mean, Gary Gygax was a madman. But let's move on to just where people can find the movie. What's the best way to support the film? Where can people find you online? How can we get behind this film to help more films like it get made down the road? Because obviously with Phil's connections at Netflix with Love, Death, and Robots, I'm just hoping they're going to say, you know what, give us a trilogy of Spine of Night movies.
That would be nice. Morgan, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we're on, at least in North America right now, we're online and all the, you can stream it or rent it. I mean, rent it or download it at all of the big places, Amazon, iTunes. I think apparently Redbox has a streaming service. Vudu, I didn't even know that was a thing. Mm-hmm. So all these people that we're very glad are streaming our film. And then I think we were just saw the other day that the Blu-ray is going to be out February 1st. And then we should be on Shudder a couple of months after that next year.
Beautiful. Yeah. I love Shudder. Yeah, it's a great brand. Yeah, both our RLJE Films and Shudder are just developing this incredible reputation for having an eye and appreciation for really interesting low budget genre fare, and I love seeing how they're like cranking up movies like Mandy and things like that. That is it's a fantastic. I feel like it's a perfect match of filmmakers with like their brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love them. I've said it a couple of times. I mean, I only subscribe really to two things, and one is Criterion and one is Shudder. And I like to think I couldn't think of a better spot for us to land, because I mean, Criterion eventually, but not until we're dead.
Yeah. People should also go to gorgonaut.net, and there you can sign up for our mailing list, where we'll be doing, I've been sending maybe like one email a week. I'm trying to keep it pretty light. But we've been like showing off some of our alternate posters there. Eventually, I might start doing like little behind the scenes, like clips of the script that were cut out, or maybe like little lore things for people who are interested. We also have a merch shop open. Yeah, Morgan, go ahead.
Look, I don't want to shill merch too hard. So everyone,
I'll shill on your behalf, and I'll include a link in the video notes. I ordered a T-shirt again last week, the week before.
Great.
It awesome. Is the coolest. Where it's like when we had the chance to make shirts and posters for this film, we went all out got just my absolute favorite artists on the planet. We were so lucky to get a poster by Ian Miller, who you all might know. He did backgrounds for Bakshi's Wizards. He's one of the original Warhammer fantasy artists. He's been around forever, and he's amazing. And he did the most tremendous poster for us that they have on the merch store as a wall flag. It's just the coolest thing in the world to me. So I regardless of selling merch, I just think it's legitimately very cool stuff. Like, our shirts are cool. The posters are very cool. I'm really excited about all of it.
Yeah, the posters they made me salivate. I was a big fan. Well, cool. Well, I will be banging the drum as much as I can on this channel and on my podcast, and just screaming to the heavens that more people need to see this movie. I'm aware that it can be a tough sell for the unconverted, but that won't stop me from screaming from the peak of the highest mountain that people need to be watching The Spine of Night, because it's like, that's the only way we get more of these. People got to vote with their dollars, buy the shirts, buy the poster, buy the movie, et cetera, and so forth. That's the only way you get people's attention.
So true. And I mean, thank you so much for sharing it with people. Like, it's really exciting to,
thank you.
I mean, I can't think of a better venue.
Yeah, well, just as a fan, just to get to pick y'all's brain about your process, your influences, what went into it. Been a huge treat for me. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on the channel and nerd out with me about your amazing movie. And I just wish y'all, whatever comes next, whatever films and shows you're associated with, I just wish the two of you the best of luck with all your future endeavors.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having us. This has been awesome.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for listening. Like I said before, I will include a link down below in the video notes for where you can find their social media, their merch shop, where you can rent the movie, etc., and so forth. But as I always like to say at the end of every video, till next time, onwards and upwards.